As most of you know, well, you new people don't know this, but you can probably tell from my accent that I'm a Southerner, right? That's easy to guess. So you may not know, but those that have been around know that I'm a native. I was born here in Statesboro, Georgia in 1950. I'll give you a moment to do the math. So I grew up with Jim Crow laws. But of course, I was among those privileged by those laws. Nevertheless, I noticed, I've shared with this congregation before that about my experience in the Dairy Queen with my dad standing in line there. They had two lines. How many of you remember two lines at places like the Dairy Queen? Oh, y'all are young. You know, remember when the Dairy Queen had two lines that we just had out front. We couldn't go in. They didn't have hamburgers and stuff, just the cones. I'm kidding. That's 1950 stuff, y'all. Forgive me. Anyway, we were in two lines. And I asked my dad about it because, and I said, why do we have, why are we in this line and at that time, colored people in the other line? He told me that the colored people were in that line and they got chocolate ice cream. And that we were in our line, and since we were white, we got vanilla ice cream. Well, of course, you know what I said, I want chocolate. I want chocolate. He said, no, you can't have chocolate. You're white, and we stand in this line and we get vanilla. I promise you, this is my daddy told me. We get vanilla, and that's just the way things are, and you have to accept it. It sort of became a metaphor for what life was like. Some things are just this way, and you just accept that. And I didn't question much about differences after that. But Jim Crow laws were not just about separating folks, right? They were designed to oppress and keep folks in their place by denying them all kinds of things, not just officially, legally, everything else. Then in the 60s and 70s, hallelujah, we had the civil rights movement. And with that and the courts, these laws were thrown out. And Jim Crow was no more, at least not officially and legally. This was brought to our attention dramatically in 2010 when Michelle Alexander published this book called The New Jim Crow. The New Jim Crow. In 2020, there was a commemorative edition. You can see the one I have up here. It says 10th anniversary edition. There was a commemorative edition. It was the same book with a different preface and a different introduction by her, but it was the same book. But in it, it had these words by the publishers of this book. They said, seldom does a book have the impact of Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow. Since it was first published in 2010, it has been cited in judicial decisions and has been adopted in campus-wide and community-wide reads. It helped inspire the creation of the Marshall Project and the new $100 million Art for Justice Fund. It has been the winner of numerous prizes, including the prestigious NAACP Image Award, and it has spent 250 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list. Most important of all, it has spawned a whole generation of criminal justice reform activists and organizations motivated by Michelle Alexander's unforgettable argument that, we had just read this earlier, we have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. As the Birmingham News proclaimed, it is undoubtedly the most important book published in this century, 21st century, about the US. Of course, it's also one of the books that is often banned by the far right group. I felt it was important enough to revisit it this year as we looked at lessons from banned books. I'll be sharing from my initial sermon at the beginning, the sermon I did back in January of 2012, followed by some updates related to what has been addressed and why I believe that we are still sadly in the era of the new Jim Crow. Now, Alexander's book is full of wonderful data in narrative form, and I hope you will read it if you have not already, or reread it even. But I'd like to make it a little easier for you to grasp what she's referring to today. And so I have some visuals that I've gathered from this sermon from the internet, primarily from a nonprofit called Beyond Bars, Beyond Bars. So Here we go. Here are the incarceration rates from 1925 to 2008. Now look at that line and see it jump up, okay? That's why the sudden rise. Most folks will point to the war on drugs. That's where the jump came. Well, you say maybe it's an increase in other crimes though, property and crimes and violent crimes, not just the war on drugs. Well, here's a slide that indicates or a graph that indicates that is not the case. You can see that's very little incline on the violent crimes and property crimes, but look at the incarceration that went up after we got into the war on drugs. Well, what's race got to do with it? What's race got to do with it? Take a look at this comparison. Hispanic and black and white. And this is per 100,000 population, okay? Some may ask, where have all the young African-American males gone? Look at this graph and look at the ages. I don't know if you can't, it's hard to see, but that mid-range of 25, when it starts starting at like 24 and on into the 30s, down to the 40s. Where are they? Many of them have gotten caught up. Now, this was in 2010 in this whole mass incarceration system. Of course, when they get out, then they're felons. And they face another kind of Jim Crow oppression, perfectly legal. Well, I won't say it's perfect, but it's legal. Shouldn't say perfectly legal, it's legal. Are more people, we might ask this, well, are more people of color using drugs and that's what it is? No. Here's a meme that shows that. 5 times as many whites are using illicit drugs as African Americans, yet African Americans are sent to prison for drug use at 10 times the rate of whites. And yes, I checked these out with various research groups. We say that's just the way the world is, right? No, that's just the way the United States is. Now this graph, you can't see the little things, but all of these are other countries, and there's the US up there. You can just look at the difference. Look at the difference. And here are a couple of memes that make that clear as well. The first one says, why does the United States have just 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population? So you see the 4 characters there, that represents the quarters of population. We have 4, the other 3/4 of the rest of the world. 2.3 million people are incarcerated in the United States. That's like locking up the combined populations of San Francisco, Pittsburgh, and Dallas. Huge prison population. Well, that makes you come to the other thing, and it's not just violent crimes, not just violent crimes. Here's another meme. To get a sense of how large a contribution the drug war has made to mass incarceration, consider this. There are more people in prisons and jails today just for drug offenses than were incarcerated for all reasons in 1980. So a lot of these are for drug offenses, and many of them get in for fairly minor drug offenses. Then they don't have the money to bail out and other kinds of things. So this one asks, well, what is the real cash crop here? What is the real cash crop? In 2020, there were 853,839 marijuana arrests in the US. Same year, 2 private prison companies made nearly $3 billion locking people up. The real cash crop is prisoners and prisons. So much money is being made now by these private prisons or private companies taking over public prisons. It's a huge industry. The prison industry is a huge industry. Now, why don't folks do something about this politically? Well, it's pretty hard to do that when you can't vote. Due to felony convictions, 5.85 million Americans are not allowed to vote for president. We need to think about that when we're going out in neighborhoods trying to register people to vote, and wonder why they don't come out and vote. Many of them are not eligible to vote. Now, that's changed somewhat in some states. There's some progress being made on some of that. If none of these have swayed you, perhaps this one will. What are the odds that your American dream will end up behind bars? That little white baby's 1 in 17. That brown baby's 1 in 6. Little black baby's 1 in 3. This has also improved somewhat, and I'll share with that with you a little bit later, but not nearly enough. Huge difference. Well, you see here that in reality, we would say, yes, it's time to end the war on drugs. We would probably say that. But the people who are making the money would say no. And these are the people with a lot of lobbyists and a lot of power. And they don't want to do that. Now, the effect of the war on drugs and mass incarceration hits close to home for me. Especially the summer of 2011. That is my one and only time I took a sabbatical. I said I didn't think I'd ever take one again. But you all gave me time off. I thought I was going to spend it meditating and going to retreats. Now, my son Fred, who died in December 29th, 2019, gave me permission to share anything about his life story that would help others. So I'm going to share a little bit of this with you today. This is not a picture of Fred, but this fella and Fred were wearing the same outfit back in 2011. That's the summer before I delivered this sermon initially. He wore it the first time, though, about a decade before. At that time, Fred was arrested for manufacturing crystal meth. He was deeply addicted himself. He was fortunate to only spend a little time in jail before being released on probation, having used up his first offender status back when he was in high school. But he was, went to a halfway house in Valdosta, Georgia. And he was a convicted felon, though, for life, and it very definitely did affect him. After leaving the halfway house, he continued working and living in Valdosta. He married his second wife while there and stayed clean till about 2010, when their marriage and his work situation went sour. And because of heated confrontations with his wife, I encouraged him to, they were living at the time at Flagler Beach. And I encouraged him to leave their home in Flagler Beach so she could come back and get her stuff, and him not be there while she was there. I said, do that. He said, oh, I've got a friend I've been wanting to go see out in Texas. Okay. So he flew to Texas on August 3rd, 2011 to spend a couple of weeks with a friend. 2 days later, he was in a federal detention facility in Texas with huge charges that carried with them 10 years to life in a federal prison, because he was the passenger in a truck that was pulling a piece of farm equipment that had over 1.5 tons of marijuana hidden in it. Long story short, he went through hell and we went through hell. He declared that he had no knowledge of what was in the equipment, but he was indicted. Now, at first, before I knew the consequences, I thought, well, he made a bad decision in going to Texas, and he'll just have to live with whatever, Well, it'll be okay, whatever it is. I didn't understand the seriousness of these charges. And I also didn't understand that federal charges were not like state charges. You couldn't go in and if you behave yourself, get out on probation. Yeah. That meant he was in for perhaps a very long sentence, especially since he'd had prior problems, possibly lifelong. How could this be? My son may have a problem with addiction, but he did not deserve life in prison. And I didn't see, I know he'd had problems before, for sure, but I didn't see how he could be involved with some Tex-Mex drug cartel, because he just was out there for 2 days. So I hired a lawyer, and we spent most of the rest of my sabbatical going back and forth to Texas, bailing him out and going for arraignment, pretrial hearings, etc. And listening to Fred tell what went on when he was incarcerated, and seeing others in the courtroom with really no chance. I'm sitting there watching the others that come forward and knowing they have no chance. No chance at all. Was enough for me to make sure I no longer stayed on the sidelines of mass incarceration. Of course, Fred was privileged. He was privileged. He had a mom who could come bail him out. That wasn't easy either, because they wanted cash, and I didn't know they wouldn't take a check or a card, and I had to go and try to get these machines to give me, and all of those, you know, that is, you can't get so much out. Oh, well. But I got it. He had a mom that could bail him out, and he had, and then he had a lawyer that could talk to the prosecutors and convince them that they did not have a good case against Fred, and it was dropped. Thank you, Francis Johnson. And Fred was white. Now, that doesn't mean that white folks are not caught up in all this insanity. Indeed, Michelle Alexander terms poor whites who are caught in this web as collateral damage sacrificed for the greater good of the drug war. I was also given new insight into the prison system through my relationship with my UU Church of the Larger Fellowship pen pal, Jacob. Jacob was in prison in California, and we've been writing for over a year at that time. He had remained positive in the midst of what had happened to him, and I don't see how he did that with the stories he told me in this prison system. He shared stories with me that brought tears to my eyes, and you all know I don't cry very easily. So why does it seem that nothing is being done? Well, for one thing, because folks who you would think would normally be upset have been too silent. The emphasis on civil rights has been on things like the continuation for various job programs or university programs for those who maybe have a little bit more elite situation. And then those who really care, like moms and other family members, are often too ashamed to speak up for their own sons who are in this situation. I know that feeling. Meanwhile, this mass incarceration has evolved over these years into a huge prison industry, with private prisons making a lot of money by keeping prisons full, and then hiring cheap labor out to other companies. Mm-hmm. It's a form of slavery. And others are making money off this as well. Now, Quentin Tarantino made a movie that Greg and I saw back in 2011 called Django that was all about slavery. And in an interview with a talk show host, he was bold enough to compare mass incarceration with slavery. Here are his words. All the reasons they had for keeping this going was the same reasons they had for keeping slavery going after the whole world had pretty much decided it was immoral. The U.S. kept it going on because it's an industry. One, what are we going to do with all these people who are let loose? And two, what are we going to do about all the people who make money off this industry? Michelle Alexander admitted that she herself had been asleep while this happened. Okay, so it was just going on until it got really, really bad, and that's when she really woke up herself. So y'all wait now. Those of you who ripped it off, put that bell in there just for that. So we have woke. We know you all. I'm sharing this today, but you all have already heard about this. You've been awakened to this, I'm sure, before this sermon. We're just reviewing it, banned book. So what's happened? Has it worked? Folks have been paying attention, and some action has been taken. Some states have enacted laws that are keeping more low-level drug offenders out of prison. They still enter the system, though, which puts many in jail for minor infractions because our bail system is such a mess, you know. The racial disparities also don't seem to be as great as they were. That African-American baby now has a 1 in 4 chance of being jailed instead of a 1 in 3 chance. But Alexander thinks the changes in this disparity may also be because more white folks were caught up in the opioid epidemic in jail. Yeah. And that Latina folks sometimes get coded as white. Her main concern, though, is that all of these folks are poor and have little hope. And even the corrections we have tried in the prison system don't seem to address, she says, the real problems. She does think we need a revolution, though. Now, Michelle Alexander now teaches at a seminary. She's a seminary professor. Now, she doesn't consider herself a religious person, okay? But she says we need a spiritual revolution, a spiritual, moral, ethical revolution in our society. She indicated in an interview during the Trump administration that it looked like everything had changed and nothing had changed since the publication of her book. People saw that racism was there in that administration and many embraced it. I agree that we have many of the problems in her book that she addressed back in 2010. But I think telling the truth about these often helps. It helps. We need to know. We need to know the truth. Now, some of you all were with me on the evening that Bullitt County dedicated this plaque. We had a group working since 2019 with the Equal Justice Initiative to make this possible. Laura Milner was one of the key people in that group that was working with them. This plaque tells the truth about lynching in Bullitt County and named those that we have a record of, ones that we have that were documented that were lynched. And I know you can't read the plaque, but I just pulled that from these. From 1886 to 2011, white mobs lynched at least 9 people in Bullitt County. I'm just going to read these, y'all, because their names need to be said. July 15th, 1886, Jake Braswell. April 11th, 1901, Kennedy Gordon. Then many of you may have heard the story. On August 16th, 1904, when Will Cato and Paula Reed were leaving the courthouse, they drug them out and burned them alive. Then after they were on a tear, they couldn't stop. They went to Albert Roberts' house, lynched him, and also another unidentified black man that we don't have his name, but they'd have the documentation there. 10 days later, August 18th, 1904, Sebastian McBride was lynched in Bullitt County. Then February 17th, 1908, Thomas Gilbert. April 21st, 1911, Henry Jackson. No one was ever held accountable for these lynchings. Let me go back before I talk about them all. I grew up here in the 1950s. I heard stories from a white perspective, but I heard stories about the lynchings, not only these, but others. People would point out things. Somebody just recently told me that when she was in a boat riding around Cypress Lake, they pointed to one of the islands out in the middle of it and said a man was lynched there. I heard of others too. My grandmother didn't live in Bullitt County, but she lived in Southeast Georgia. She tells me that when she was growing up, that there were actually hunts, like you can go hunting for some animal with dogs and stuff. And she said that her dad, they didn't let him in the house, but he didn't mind if they hid under the house. These were probably people that worked on his farm or nearby. And she said they would hide under the house and she could look through the cracks in the floor and see them, children too, under the house during those days. So these are 9 that were documented, but I guarantee you this is just a small portion, Now, in my other community, Brunswick, they don't have to look back in history. What happened to Ahmaud Arbery was a lynching. They thought he entered a house he shouldn't have entered that was being built. Accused him of, thought, well, maybe he's taking something. Wonder why they thought that. He was just on his run, and he usually took a break, walked around the house, looked around. How many times do any of you saw a house being built and walk around looking? Okay. But they hunted him down with their trucks and guns and killed him. And killed him. These events are difficult to talk about. But folks, we need to know the truth if we're not to make the same mistakes again. And in this day and age, with all the lies spread by some to divide us and make us hate one another, even using robots to do it, and it's happening big, y'all, trying to pull us apart and make us hate one another, that makes it more difficult. We have to be vigilant in seeking and sharing the truth. And hopefully the truth will lead us closer to that promised land one day. That promised land one day, that home we were just talking about, lead us closer, whatever that promised land is. Now, we recently celebrated Martin Luther King Day. There's a lot of quotes we had. We had a wonderfully Thurgood Johnson sharing with us when last time I was here. But here's a quote that you also hear. This quote was from Martin Luther King's speech the night before he was murdered, okay? He said, I would like to live a long life, but I'm not concerned about that now. I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but we will get to the promised land. As I get older, quotes like this mean something to me too. I'm glad nobody shot me earlier or something. But I know, you know, I'm in this last period, last quarter, whatever it might be. I don't know how long. And I'm thinking, I thought we'd be further along now. But I'm going to keep on going with you all. And we're going to get as close as we can, okay? We may not, some of you are a little older too. We may not get there, but we can get a little closer. A little closer there, a little closer to the promised land. So I'm asking you to come go with me. And I'll ask you to rise in body or spirit and join me as we sing this song. All right, y'all ready? Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. There'll be freedom. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land where I'm bound. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land. There'll be freedom in that land where I'm just. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land. There'll be justice in that land where I'm bound. So come and go with me. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land. Come and go with me to that land where I'm bound. May it be so. Amen. Blessed be. You may be seated. Some things we can do.